On behalf of the U.S. Association of Former Members of Congress, I welcome you to this online panel discussion, Beyond Red versus Blue, the Future of Nonpartisan Primaries and Ranked Choice Voting. My name is Greg Giroux, and I'm a senior reporter with the Bloomberg government publication based in Washington, D.C., where I cover elections, redistricting, and Congress. I'm grateful to FMC for the opportunity to be moderator for this event. We'll kick off the discussion right after I introduce our distinguished panelists. There will be time for audience Q&A toward the end of this hour-long program, and I encourage you to start thinking of questions to submit throughout the event via the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And now for today's panelists. Senator Mark Begich of Alaska served in the U.S. Senate from 2009 to 2015, the only Democrat to be elected to the position in the last 4 decades. During his tenure in the Senate, he earned the reputation of a hardworking, pragmatic problem solver who was willing to work across party lines to get things done. Prior to serving in the U.S. Senate, he served as mayor of Alaska's largest city, Anchorage, for 6 years and sat on the city's assembly for another 10 years before becoming mayor. He currently serves as president and CEO of Northern Compass Group, where he continues to work on key issues facing Alaska, including resource development, tourism, fisheries, and matters impacting Alaska natives. As many of you know, in 2020, Alaska voters narrowly passed Measure 2, which implemented a nonpartisan blanket top 4 primary system and ranked choice voting in the state. That was a system that was first used in the 2022 elections, and Senator Begich has up-close experience with the electoral reforms we'll discuss on the panel today. Thank you, Senator, for joining us. Senator Tim Hutchinson served Arkansas in the U.S. Senate from 1997 to 2003, making him the first Republican senator to serve the state since Reconstruction and the first Republican to ever be popularly elected to the Senate from Arkansas. Thus, he is no stranger to the one-party domination seen in most states and congressional districts today. In Congress, he focused on and implementing reforms in various policy areas, including welfare, education, and veterans health care. Before winning election to the Senate in 1996, he served 2 terms in the U.S. House representing Northwest Arkansas's 3rd congressional district, as well as 8 years in the Arkansas House of Representatives. After leaving the Senate, he served as senior director at Greenberg Traurig until he retired. He currently serves as a member of FMC's board of directors. Thank you, Senator, for joining us. And Nick Troiano is a civic entrepreneur based in Denver, Colorado. He is the executive director of Unite America, a national organization that works to bridge the growing partisan divide by enacting political reforms and electing candidates who put people over party. In addition to his role leading Unite America, he authored the recent book, The Primary Solution, Rescuing Our Democracy from the Fringes. In the book, he makes the case for abolishing party primaries and implementing electoral reforms like those we'll discuss today in order to empower a larger segment of the American electorate. In 2016, he was named to Forbes 30 Under 30 for Law and Policy after, among other things, garnering a significant amount of national attention for being the most successful independent candidate of the 2014 cycle when he ran for Pennsylvania's then 10th congressional district. Thank you, Nick, for joining us. So I appreciate all of our panelists for their generosity, their time and participation. So let's get into it. We're here to discuss nonpartisan primaries and ranked choice voting. I think what nonpartisan primaries are compared to partisan primaries that are the norm in most states, I think most people have a handle on, but where Republican candidates and Democrat candidates run in separate party elections. But it may be helpful just to have a quick refresher on what ranked choice voting is. Under ranked choice voting systems, voters choosing among 3 or more candidates are permitted to rank as many of them as they can in order of preference. If no one wins a majority of the vote on the first ballot, the ranked choice votes of the lowest performing candidates are redistributed to the top performing candidates until someone does win a majority. It serves to instantly simulate a runoff election without the cost of organizing a second election. I covered the first congressional election to produce a winner by ranked choice voting. It was a 2018 U.S. House election in Maine, where he had 4 candidates running: incumbent Republican Bruce Poliquin, Democratic challenger Jared Golden, and 2 independent candidates. Poliquin led Golden in the initial ballot tally narrowly, with the 2 independents taking the remainder of the vote. But because no candidate won a majority, the ranked choice voting rules, were invoked, and Golden pulled ahead and won the election after the second choice votes of the independent candidates were transferred to Golden and Poliquin. Golden was the second preference over Poliquin on more ballots from voters who ranked the independent candidates first. And so that's what happened in Maine in 2018. Now, Alaska has an even more unique system of electing candidates that's even newer and was first used in the 2022 election with very consequential results. And I think there's no better person to maybe discuss the Alaska system than Senator Begich. Senator, perhaps you can share some thoughts on the Alaska system, how it came about, and how the new primary um, and general election system in Alaska influenced the 2022 U.S. Senate and U.S. House election in Alaska.
You bet. Thank you very much. Thanks for being here. Thanks for the FMC for hosting this. They do these great programs all around the country at times and around the world. So I'm just happy to be here. I am one of those that actually, when it was first presented in Alaska, a former governor, a Republican governor, and I teamed up and opposed actually the ranked choice voting system that was proposed, which was driven by initiative and got in on the ballot. In Alaska, you can put a lot of things on the ballot through initiative process. And when that happens, then the voters will make the decision at the end of the day. And it becomes a very contentious at times, depending on the issue. This got to the ballot. There was opposition. Myself was in opposition to it for a variety of reasons. And then there was a group out there supporting it, spent millions of dollars. They also brought forward two elements to it. One was the ranked choice voting by itself. It's complicated to explain it in a ballot initiative, frankly. And so people were kind of like, what does it mean? And then in that ballot initiative, they also had some more disclosure on campaign donations, which always gets people excited. More disclosure, more. So coupling those two together brought it to the voters. And in that case, it won by a couple percentage points. It wasn't a big landslide. It's in process, as you said, but oddly enough, this year on the ballot will be a repeal of it by a group of people who think it's not working in their favor or working in the sense that people thought. Now, saying that, in Alaska, it has worked. I believe now, and I've said this to groups that have asked me, I now support the system. The public voted for it, slim margin. But what it's doing is it's forcing candidates. Think about this. In our congressional campaign that had to occur when Congressman Young passed away, we had 50 candidates. And let me say it again, 50. So going to a primary, you can only imagine what that was going to be like. Well, off it went to the primary, 50 candidates running, people trying to vie for whatever voice they could get. It narrowed down to 4 at the end of the day. And as you described, after you get through that primary, the 4 then move on to the general election, and then it's a ranked choice again. And in that ranked choice, Mary Peltola, who was kind of not necessarily in the first 50, going to be the winner. And when she got into the group before, she now sits as a congressional member of Congress. And she's more moderate. In Alaska, people get confused, frankly. They think it's just a deep red state. It's not. It's a mixed bag. Because of that, for example, our House and Senate right now, state Senate is made up of 20 senators, state senators, 17 are in the coalition, Republican and Democrat. Because one thing this does, it drives people who may be more moderate to work together to try to solve problems. In the House, it's a little more split, but again, it's a coalition in our state House. So it's an interesting process. What it does in some cases, it eliminates the very hard right and hard left in states, in my view, that have that kind of more moderate tone to it. There are certain states where it will just elect the more, if it's a Republican state, I'll use Wyoming as an example, where it's predominantly Republican in all cases. It's just going to elect a Republican. In California, we see the Democrats there controlling, the first 2 or 3 when they get to the top, even though that's not a ranked choice, it's a selection of the top 2. So it drives moderate states to create a different kind of dynamic. These states are like, when you think about it, Nevada, Arizona, to some degree, Georgia, you can go through the list that kind of create this different dynamic. It also gives people who may not have a lot of money. Mary Peltola was outraised in the first group. um, and was able to get to the end. So voters are still um, adjusting to it here in Alaska, I would say, but that's why there's a ballot initiative. But I would say, and I know I think Nick's group was part of the effort up here, I'm pretty sure. But frankly, one of the things I opposed in it when it first ran was the coupling of it with financial issues, because that's what they campaigned on mostly. And it got people to think about it as a campaign finance reform versus an election reform. Because when you do polling data, people love getting rid of dark money. They love getting rid of all the limits, all that. And, I'm not pushing against Nick here, but I would say it was a great campaign tactic. But it was a little, it wasn't full disclosure, you might say, to the voter of what the whole package was. But at the end of the day, voters, in my belief, are informed. They know what they're voting for. People who say, oh, voters don't know what they're doing, I think is a mistake to think that. That's why it was a close vote in the public arena. A lot of money was spent to campaign against it and for it. Now it's in place. We'll see if it holds steady as we move into the November elections and August elections, as it is on the ballot to repeal it. And frankly, it's mostly done by a hardcore group of people, very, very partisan. I'm a Democrat, registered Democrat, always will be a Democrat, but some folks in my party, as well as the Republican Party in Alaska, have decided they want to go back to the old ways of doing business, and the country has changed. And, I ran an assembly and mayor's race. Those were nonpartisan races. So it was whoever can give the best idea. And yet people knew kind of who was more progressive, who was more conservative. But at the end of the day, they had to vote for the person, not a party influence. So Alaska is still an experiment, I think. We probably have 2 more cycles to go through to really see if it holds steady.
Yeah, I'll definitely be looking at that initiative on the 2024 ballot.
Yes.
Which is striking to me how under the new system, Senator Murkowski was reelected, the only Republican running for re-election in 2022, voted to convict President Trump. And of course, she lost when Alaska had party primary. She lost the 2010 primary before winning in an extraordinary write-in campaign for re-election, which rarely happens.
That's right.
Nick, you've
And
written and said that.
Can I say
I'm sorry, go
one
ahead,
quick thing?
please.
Yeah, just
Sorry.
on that. If they did not have ranked choice voting, Senator Murkowski would not be senator today, in my opinion. And if I go back and I look at the data, which we have done since then, in the 2014 election, because the way the dynamics were working, we only lost my Senate race by a couple percent. We would have won that race. But in Lisa Murkowski's case, it was clearly an advantage for her. If she did not have that, she would not be in the U.S. Senate, especially going against the tide, as you just said, Greg, about she voted to impeach in a state that, I said it's not a red state, but it does lean red in a national election, and votes for Donald Trump. So.
Got it. Great. Thank you for that. Yeah. Nick, you've written and said that party primaries are the biggest solvable problem. So what is the problem with partisan primaries, and how is it solvable?
Well, I also want to just thank FMC for organizing this. It's an honor to be with the 2 senators and yourself, Greg. And thanks for making the time to learn more about this issue. It's very nascent. Although these ideas have been around a long time, really Alaska put it on the map in 2022 when it first used this system, and we're going to see a lot more states consider it. So it's a timely topic. The organization I run, United America, our perspective is that party primaries have become the biggest solvable problem in our politics. It's a big problem because as we have sorted ourselves geographically, as the parties have polarized, the primary election these days is the whole ballgame. When you look at the U.S. House of Representatives, for example, 83% of seats nowadays are decided in the primary, not the November general election. And in the primaries, you have not only lower turnout, but in close to half the states, there's restrictions about who can vote in them. Pennsylvania is voting today, for example, in their party primaries. Close to 1.5 million independent voters are locked out. And so the primaries are not producing candidates that are broadly representative. So they disenfranchise a bunch of voters, including half of all veterans that identify as independents, a majority of young people. It's not a great thing for democracy. And on the flip side of that coin, the primary system disincentivizes our leaders from working together to solve problems. As all of you, I'm sure, have experienced and taken note, the idea of a primary used to be a noun. These days, it's a verb. It's what happens when you don't toe the party line, when the party activists or special interests may field a candidate against you in a primary. There's been some good research that has shown that the frequency of ideologically motivated primary challenges is 3.5 times higher in the last decade than it was in the 2 decades prior. So this is a modern phenomena around the threat of being primaried. And that, in our view, is what is driving even more gridlock and partisanship in Congress. So that's why it's a big problem. The reason why it's a solvable problem is because, as Senator Begich alluded, this can be addressed at the state level. It doesn't require a constitutional amendment nor an act of Congress for states to make some reforms. And our North Star is in seeing party primaries being replaced by nonpartisan primaries, which is essentially a ballot that has all the candidates on it with their party affiliations. And that, A, gives every voter the ability to vote for whomever they want in every election, and B, ensures that whoever does ultimately win does so with majority support. 5 states have done this so far, not all in the same way. You have Louisiana that got rid of its primaries in the 70s. You have Washington, California, and Nebraska that have used a top 2 system, either for state or federal office. And then you have Alaska now with what we think is the most powerful iteration of this, which is this top 4 election with an instant runoff in the general election. So in sum, that's why we see it as the biggest solvable problem, and hopefully more states sort of following Alaska's lead to come.
Mm-hmm. And Senator Hutchinson, I'd like your thoughts on nonpartisan primaries and ranked choice voting. As I mentioned at the top, when you were elected to the Senate in 1996, popularly elected Republican. Now it seems in Arkansas, the winner of the Republican primaries is tantamount to winning the general election. Maybe talk about what is the Arkansas primaries were like, and how what concerns have been out there among segments of the voting population about resisting nonpartisan primaries and ranked choice voting.
Yeah, well, first of all, let me thank FMC for doing it, and thank you for being willing to moderate today. It's a couple of general observations. Number one, I think those who are advocating and promoting for ranked choice voting are well intended. They see the hyperpartisanship and the polarization of the country, and they want results that better reflect the overall electorate. I think the idea of reducing fringe candidates, getting the nominations, I think that's a very good thing. And the goal of reducing negative campaigning, increasing civility. So all of those things are good. And I would also say that I want to, what would we say in the Senate, disassociate myself from the far right that see in ranked choice voting a kind of almost conspiracy, a kind of effort on the left and progressives to re-engineer our electoral system to the benefits of one political party or to help the Democrats. And I reject that. I think it is neutral as to who benefits electorally from making that kind of change. Now, Greg, you asked about Arkansas. So when I was in the state legislature in Arkansas and the House of Representatives, there were 91 Democrats, 9 Republicans. That gives you an idea of what it was like in every constitutional office, and 95% of the courthouse officials were all Democrats. The outcome of the Democratic primary was tantamount to election in those days. It is, as you said, it's done 180 degrees. Today, it is whoever wins the Republican primary is generally considered going to be the next elected official. The state has totally reversed direction on it. But the system, the primary system has not changed. So we have an open primary. So Democrats can vote in the Republican primary, Republicans can vote in the Democratic primary, independents can vote in either primary. There have been efforts to restrict that, and they thus far have failed. So it's an open primary, and we have a runoff system. So we're going to have a nominee who has a majority of the primary vote. It's usually, I think it's 3 weeks after the initial primary. If there's not a majority winner, if you have several candidates and nobody gets over 50%, you have a second election. Greg, you mentioned that they're expensive. Well, I'm not sure they're that much more expensive than what's involved in ranked choice voting, but there are some downsides to it. And the downside, to me, the primary downside is you get a much lower voter turnout. So voter participation is much less in a runoff election. If you have ranked choice voting, you got the whole process on one day, one election, and you eliminate that issue. So I have a number of concerns, questions. I guess I would put them in that, which I can go over now, or we can get into it as we discuss. I think delays in reporting and confusion for the voter are legitimate concerns. I'm told that in the New York mayoral Democratic primary back in 2021, that there were 11 rounds of tabulations in a week of counting. Well, I can see that as being something that happens perhaps frequently, and I think it undermines trust in the system. And I've also thought about, and I'm hoping that Nick's going to give me some answers, and I'm sure he's got answers on all of these concerns. But I've tried to envision what it's like as far as delays in voting. The long lines at the voting booth, to me, are one of the big discouragements for people actually participating in the electoral process and going out and voting on election day. The thought of standing for an hour, hour and a half, people do it, but it really, how many don't do it because of that very long process? Well, if you have, let's say, 15 races on the ballot, and there are on average 4 candidates running for each one of those races, you've got 60 that you've got to go through and rank those. I just from a practical standpoint of the time involved, to me, that is going to be a discouragement to participation as well. And I could go on, but I think more than anything, we need time to evaluate states like Alaska, states like Maine. Greg, you gave the example of the person who Poliquin, who won the first round, who won a plurality of the votes, narrowly missing a majority of the votes, and yet by the time all of the ranked voting went through, he ended up the loser. And there's something, I think, to many Americans that just smacks as not seeming right when somebody got the most votes, but they didn't win. And I understand the process, I understand the logic, and I'm certainly not dismissing it. But I think for a lot of Americans, voting is an incredibly important tradition in this country, and tinkering with it ought to be a very serious thought. Ought to be very cautiously done. We ought to be reticent about making dramatic changes. And for all of its problems, one vote, one person, one vote is simple and clear. And so we ought to be careful about moving away from it. Thanks, Greg.
Sure. And then maybe some just questions that any and all of you can jump in. Let me just play some, devil's advocate for a few questions. Defenders of closed partisan primaries say they're better because they would prevent voters from meddling in the nomination process of another party. That political parties ought to be able to set their own nomination rules as they see fit. And other opponents of our ranked choice voting say it makes elections too convoluted and confusing. What say any of you to maybe those positions?
I'll give some quick thoughts on the partisan primaries. Everyone is different. In Alaska, our Democratic primary is an open, kind of quasi-open. Before it's changed, and the Republicans was a closed primary. So you talk about confusion to the voter when 54% of our voters were non-registered. So when they came in to figure out which primary they're allowed to vote in and when, it caused more confusion. I think, the senator brings up good points about, there is it's an experiment. I mean, I think Nick would agree that it's not like this is the answer because they've had modifications over this. Alaska is a new experiment, kind of a new and improved product in a way. And for all the reasons that the senator talked about, that's many of the reasons why I opposed it, because it wasn't clear. And then you get into, a state Senate or, your governor's race, your U.S. Senate race, your U.S. House race, your lieutenant governor race, your state Senate race, your state House race. And then, just the ballot alone for the congressional race that year with 50 names on it. You first had to, because we do random selection of names, so it changes at every ballot. So you're going to have to keep looking for where the people are. So I think there's some more work to be done in that arena to make sure it is done in a way that people can respond appropriately. And the partisan part of it is still there. There's no two ways about it. But coupled with this, and I don't know where the senator and Nick stand on this, but you have two other elements, maybe three. As you work to reform the voting, you also have to reform the access to voting, how much it costs to run, and the convoluted reapportionment efforts that are done around the country that actually more affect congressional House seats, obviously, and have made them, and I think the senator will probably agree with this, more partisan than ever before on both sides. Very
Absolutely.
extreme.
Absolutely.
And that is, these are the four elements. If we want, people to be able to access the right to vote, which is, as said, fundamental to what makes us a country, this is just a piece of the puzzle. And I would say it's based on frustration, from my opinion, of the partisanship that has gone, to the extreme because of many other things that are pushing it to the extreme. Because now, and the senator and I can probably agree on this for sure, and that is, once you get elected, the question is, are they going to push the envelope, those elected officials, to be that middle? And we're seeing in the House the challenge of that in the U.S. Congress right now. I mean, the poor speaker, may you like him or not, it doesn't matter. He's on deathbed every day with one vote margin. That is not how you make big things happen in this country. And so all the reasons that the senator said, the partisan piece of it is, are you electing someone who really says there's somebody, but then when you find out their policies later, they're not, because they didn't go through a primary process that really exposes your fundamental principles of who you are. That's one of the arguments I used when I opposed this was, okay, 50 people run, name ID, they get elected. Then you find out later, well, they said they were progressive or they said they were conservative. And then you find out not so much because they didn't have to say it in order to get to the fore, right? It's kind of like, you want to get to the game and you want to be in the top four. So I think it's an experiment. And, one thing about America and this country with democracy, it's always been one big experiment. And this may not work at the end of the day, but I think legitimate arguments. I mean, I know I went through this with the 7 different races I had to go rank, and it takes time. And that's why, in Anchorage, for example, it's all mail-in ballot. You can do it at your home, relax, have conversation with your friends. And, that to me helped changes the dynamic a little bit.
Nick, I don't want to cut Nick off. Go ahead, Nick.
Okay, happy to go. I think, as much as I have conviction and believer in these reforms, I think approaching with wariness anytime we make any change to our election system is important, because we have to maintain public trust in the system and in results in the system. So I think this is a good conversation to be having. I also think when we think about trust in the system, it's clear right now that our political system as a whole is bleeding trust from most Americans. It's because they see a system in which broadly popular ideas among the public aren't translated into public policy. And it's because our institutions have become unrepresentative of the people, which is, I think, an argument for these reforms. We can't compare them to perfect. We have to compare them to the status quo. And right now, we know the status quo is giving disproportionate influence to the far left and far right through this system of party primaries. And the idea of experimentation really is the tradition of our country. We didn't have primaries when the country was founded, right? This was an invention of 100 years ago when reformers looked at the old caucus and convention system and said, that's becoming corrupt. that the candidates being handpicked weren't very representative, and so they changed it. We didn't always elect the Senate. We changed that too. We didn't always have a secret ballot. So this is, I think, in line with the proud tradition of what Americans have done when democracy has gotten a bit off track, and why I think there's so much interest in it now. The last thing I would say, just to address some of the specific concerns, is that while there's always some upfront reservation to change, when people use this new voting system, they tend to like it. You know, we did exit polling in Alaska that showed close to 80% of voters actually called the new system simple. 99.9% of ballots that were cast were valid, meaning they followed the instruction correctly and their votes were accurately recorded. When we talk about ranked choice voting, the ability to rank your choices is just that. It's an option for you. If you want to vote the old way, you're no worse off than you used to be. I actually think this gives an incentive for participation because people have a greater ability to actually make their full perspective, their nuanced perspective known. You know, in Alaska, just to use one more example, what we saw is in the primary, more than half of voters actually voted for a split ticket, a Democrat in one race, a Republican in another. And by the time the general election rolled around, close to 80% actually ranked more than one candidate. And so this gives more voice and more choice to the voters, which is what I actually think we'll see an increase in voter participation when people actually feel their vote can make a difference, not just whether they have access to the ballot, but does that ballot actually translate into leaders who represent their views and values?
Well, as I did a little research on this subject, I was surprised. I guess I shouldn't have been. That even the debate on ranked choice voting has become politicized. It's become polarized. With the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank, adamantly opposed to this reform, Cato defending it and pointing out that in one form or another, it's existed for over 100 years in other countries, in Ireland and in Australia, and it hasn't disenfranchised conservatism or the Conservative Party. They've been quite competitive. So I think it reflects exactly where our country is. Nick, I have thought that the best argument for ranked choice voting and the best example of its need, well, I'll give you this hypothetical. There are, it's the presidential primary in an early state, Republican primary for president. There are 12 people running for president. There's one of them that has a very strong, energized, engaged base, and the rest of them are fighting amongst themselves. The election comes, and the candidate with the energized base gets 30% of the vote, and the others scatter around the other 70%. It, as much of the states in the Republican primaries for president, is a winner-takes-all system. So though that candidate only got 30% of the vote, they get all of the delegates from the state for the national convention and for the nominating process. The process is repeated the next week, and a sense of momentum grows, and then a sense of inevitability grows. And so you end up with a presidential nominee who the majority of the political party does not support. You can fill in the blank on who I'm talking about.
I'm trying to figure if that was hypothetical or real.
But I think that the ranked voting, if you could get political parties to adopt that in their primary system, it would do an awful lot to eliminate the more extreme polarizing candidates as the nominees.
Yeah, I think
if I can
go ahead.
Go ahead, Nick. Go ahead.
Just a quick point. I think that's a great use case of using ranked choice voting in the primary. And you think about what it can solve for in the general election. And right now we're in an election year in which there's a lot of talk about potential or declared third-party candidates and the role that they may play in spoiling the election for one side or the other. That whole spoiler problem is a function of our plurality winner system, where you can wind up voting for the candidate you like the best, but unintentionally help elect the candidate you want the least. You know, under this system where you can rank your candidates, it eliminates that problem. And so we might actually level the playing field and see more competition and dispense with this whole concern about which way third-party candidates may tip the election. So there's a value proposition for this voting reform in both the primary and the general election.
And one thing, just to clarify, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, please do. Go ahead, Sanders. Sorry.
I was just gonna say, Nick, one thing you said, and it's just more of it depends how you look at this. When I, again, oppose this issue, when you said no worse off than if you voted one time and the other people voted ranked, yes, you're right, you still get to vote. But if you only vote once, the people who vote 3 or 4 times do have an advantage. There's no two ways about it, because they're utilizing that extra vote to move their candidate. Now, that's a choice that people are making, right? It's not it's not the ballot saying you have to do it, but if you decide, and Mary Peltola uses very effectively. She said, vote once. Don't vote for a second and third and fourth choice. Don't do it. Because if she got into second position by some position, she might not have gotten where she is today. This was in the general election. So when you only vote once, you do disenfranchise yourself because you're giving up 3 more options. And that is, I think, important, because I know, for example, in Alaska right now, the congressional candidates, which oddly enough is my nephew and a former or current lieutenant governor, the two are running as Republicans, and they're basically saying vote red. In other words, even if you maybe out of the 2 Republicans, 1-2, but maybe really 1-2 is, maybe it's my nephew and then Mary Peltola, they're saying don't vote for her. Now, that's a campaign technique. That's all that this creates, is some more techniques. But at the end of the day, a voter who votes once does disenfranchise themselves to a certain level. Now, it's self-imposed, but it does create. But if you vote, and I'm not arguing against myself, I'm just using one of the arguments I used when I was against this issue, and that is, if you only have 1 vote, if all 4 of us just had 1 vote, well, it's 1 vote. That's it. End of the game. But under ranked choice voting, a single voter that votes once does disenfranchise themselves. So you can't, I don't think it's fair to use the comment that you're no worse off. You are. You self-impose yourself into that. But, so I just, I think it's again, I think all of us agree it's kind of an experiment. And I don't know what will happen. I think the thing that's killing this country is we've gotten so extreme that we're, instead of looking at the candidates and saying, why are you not doing A, B, and C? When Senator Hutchinson was in office, it was a different time. People actually sat across the aisle, worked out their problems, and we've gotten in this polarized state of this country, which is driven, frankly, by personalities, not necessarily by systems. The system, if the personalities won't change, then we're defaulting, which is fine to a certain degree, to change the system, to force new personalities. I'm just not sure, the world that we live in, with millions of dollars spent, beating the hell out of each candidate, driving them into look how many have quit the House this year, not because, they want to retire and go on to do other things. No, they're tired. They're tired of the bickering person. And that's our, if this system helps change that, as I'm all for experimenting, more of this is better. Because if this country is going to be great and do what it needs to do, we have to figure this out. And we can't have a speaker hanging on, I don't care who it is, by 1 vote every single day. That is, so sorry, I get on the soapbox because I think the system itself is fractured. And this is a major piece of an experiment to see if we can get it realigned in some way and get good people who want to run and, frankly, take the political abuse that comes with it and do good things. And that's a hard thing right now to get. I don't know, I'm always talking to people about running. They don't say yes 90% of the time, frankly. They look at me and say, yeah, forget it.
So I had a question for Nick, if I might.
Please.
When you speak of nonpartisan primaries, that seems to me to be like the jungle primary, like California. Is that your preferred solution to the problem of primaries?
It is. And I like the term nonpartisan all candidate primary, if only because it conveys exactly what it is, which is one ballot. Everyone gets all your candidates on it. And the question is, when you go to a nonpartisan all-candidate primary, is how many, if you vote for your favorite candidate, how many candidates should advance to the general election? The California and Washington model advance 2, and as we've discussed, Alaska advances 4. And because it advances 4 is the reason for ranked choice voting in the general election. That's the connection between these two reforms, because when you have 4 candidates in the general election, you don't want one to win, using your example before, with just 30% support. You want to find the candidate that most voters support, hence the instant runoff in the general election. And another way of thinking about this is, what is the impact that that change has on candidates? Is the example I like to use, because she's told this story before, is Kathy Giesel. She served in the Alaska State Senate. She was primaried out of office in 2020. She runs again under this system. How does this change the way she campaigns? Under the old system, you'd get a list from the party as to who your active primary voters are, and you target them with your communication because they're the only ones that can be able to vote. And once you get through the primary, if you're in a safe district, the election's over. Under the new system, she threw out the old voter list and just knocked on every door in her district. And when it came time for the general election, she put together a majority coalition of Democrats, Republicans, and independents. And that, I think, goes right to the Senator Begich's point of thinking about, what does democracy look like today when our leaders are accountable to a true majority, when they speak to all of their voters, not just their party base. It's a much healthier, system. And the root of that impact is the change to the primary process. When we get away from this bifurcated system of having to get through one party or another to the general election, and you have to, from day one, campaign to a majority, is what I think unlocks the potential of these reforms.
I appreciate you bringing up California. As was noted, California and also Washington State elect their candidates and through so-called top 2 primaries, in which all candidates of all partisan political affiliations or party preferences are listed on one ballot. Voters may vote for any candidate, and the top 2 vote getters for the office, regardless of party affiliation, advance to the general election. So I appreciate you bringing that up. Just one more reminder to the audience that you can use the Q&A button at the bottom to submit any questions or comments. We've got about 20 minutes left in the program. We'll get to Q&A in a few minutes. I would like to bring up, what it's, all 3 of you have been on the election ballots before. You've run candidate-centered campaigns. I'm wondering what kind of, how a candidate campaign would differ from like an initiative campaign to try and get nonpartisan primaries or ranked choice voting on the ballot, or opponents of the Alaska system, what they're trying to do in 2024. What kind of messages work best to shape public opinion for things like this? And it's said that it's always a challenge to get voters interested in political process questions. How do you get everyday average voters interested in matters like this?
Well, I think the strongest message, what most Americans understand about our country and our electoral process, is that we're so polarized. We're in our enemy camps, that they're what Mark referred to as the way we used to when we worked across the aisle, and we were pragmatic enough to solve problems, and that for a variety of reasons, from social media to the news networks to the gerrymandering, we have become an increasingly polarized country. I think the message that sells is that this is a means of reducing the amount of negative advertising, increasing the amount of civility in the process, and that's what people want, and that's a very appealing message from this whole reform. Nick, I'm curious, what have you found to be the most sellable, marketable means of advocating for the reforms you?
Yeah, well, I think we come at this, of course, from the standpoint of polarization and election outcomes and who it might bet, what type of candidate. I think for voters, it's simpler in terms of values around fairness. Just the idea that every voter should be able to vote for any candidate in every election, is a selling point. I think people value a level playing field in our political system. And I think the cherry on top of that is the value proposition that this can elect candidates that are just more broadly representative, because I don't think we have to do a lot to convince people the current system is broken. I think most Americans feel that way. And if we can engineer some hope that through this system, they will have more, not just voice in the elections, but more power to hold their leaders accountable, that's been another angle that we've found, successful with and resonates with voters in different states, and regardless of their political affiliation as well. There's a certain populist element here, right? Like, I think populism can be used in negative ways. It can also be used in some positive ways. And I think the populist nature of reforms giving more power to the people rather than to party bosses and sort of special interests is the other angle that, has motivated public support.
I just figure that if there are 4 candidates in a primary and you have ranked choice voting, you're going to be more reluctant to attack some of the others if you need them as a second pick for yourself.
Right.
That's got to improve some civility, or at least some level of reducing negative campaigning, I would think.
I think it does. I think what happens is let's say you are very partisan and you have your 20%, 22%. At the end of the day, you don't win with that. You have to be a much broader. I will tell you, we just had a mayor's election. It's not a ranked choice, but it's a nonpartisan top 2 advance to the next race. And unless you get 45%, then you win automatically. It's the person who came in third. When you look at all the polling data, the first 2 were more partisan, one conservative, one progressive. The one who came in third was second choice when we saw polling data, second choice to every candidate who was running in the mayor's race. And not only that, he was liked by the business community and the labor community. He had what we call a perfect line, meaning that it depends on what age group, he was liked predominantly. And here's the most amazing thing. And this is where, if it was ranked choice voting, he might have got to be in the runoff and then probably won at the end of the day. But because we don't have ranked choice in our municipal mayor's race, it's just the top 2. He came in third. But what was more interesting is when you looked at the person who got first place, they had what we call a net positive rating of 2 percentage points. In other words, as many people disliked him, liked him, but only by a couple points extra. The other person had a net negative of 22%. And a lot of people didn't like him. The third place one had a net positive of 25%. Okay, that person was the best liked, and yet came in third because everyone wanted to vote their first preference, which is the more, fundamental view of us. Right? I think, Tim, you and I could sit down and say, here's our 5 principles. And we might, in a list, say, we're going to pick that person because they're with us. But you know what? If they lose, I still want at least 3 of my 5 principles covered by the next guy, right? And
right.
This guy, and he didn't have a lot of money at the beginning. He got in kind of late. But when you looked at the dynamics of the race, I was surprised. He moved 5 percentage points, moved from single digit to double digit in less than 8 days. So you could tell he was in a movement trend. And that's significant movement. But yet he just couldn't get there. But when you looked, the most conservative candidate, he was the second choice. The most progressive candidate, he was the second choice. It was very interesting. And if it was ranked choice, I don't know, might have got the second. And in a runoff race, that's what you're vying for, right? It's like that old car commercial. You're not vying to be number 1. Being number 2 is just as good,
Okay, well, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Senator Hutchinson.
Well, I had a question for both Mark and Nick, and that is, like the state of California or Alaska, where you had an initiative where it passed. The parties are so strong, the political parties, and they're so entrenched. How did you overcome the partisan resistance to enact something that arguably is not to the benefit of the political parties?
Nick, I'll give a quick one because I can criticize you a little bit here and be okay. You can take it. I know you can, because you got my son to write an editorial against me. So as I said, I opposed the ranked choice voting along with a former Republican governor. And the parties were very, I mean, you had Democrat Party, Republican Party joined together, first time, right? First bipartisan thing they've done. And so they were opposed to it for right reasons. They didn't have the amount of money. Nick, through his organization, frankly, has a lot of resources that could be garnered. I want to say $4 or $5 million, maybe more, was spent in Alaska. So it overwhelmed the opposition system. Even with that, it was a very close vote. And like I said, and I wasn't joking, my son wrote a op-ed piece against my op-ed piece, which I can't remember if we got in the Post or the Wall Street Journal. I can't remember. Then they got my son, and we're actually now considering writing a piece together to oppose the state repeal of this. Yeah. So it's and Nick can answer, but I mean, frankly, Nick spent his group and others spent a bunch of money and educated the voters, but they did, as I mentioned at the beginning, and I'm not saying it was bad, it's just politics. They use a technique to add the finance piece into it because Alaska has always had this as an issue. Campaign finance, we've had some of the most restrictive laws until recently thrown out by the Ninth Circuit and others, where their appetite was, let's get this dark money out of it. Ironically, Nick's group was dark money promoting the idea of it, and that was some of the criticism, but they disclosed, they did what they needed to do, but that's how we saw it in Alaska. California is probably I can't even imagine the initiative process in California. Wouldn't want to.
Yeah, a couple points I would add. So one, I think the political environment right now is ripe generally for these reforms, but it was particularly in Alaska. In 2020, I mentioned Senator Giesel, but there were multiple state legislators primaried out of office for working across the aisle. And so I think voters did not like seeing that happen. Secondly, Alaska has had a history of electing people to office without true majority support, and that has caused some interest in these reforms. And thirdly, if you go back 20 years, Alaska used to have a nonpartisan primary. It had a version of it, though, that was struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court until there was a change in the design of the system that was actually upheld on appeal at the U.S. Supreme Court. So there was context in Alaska for this. It wasn't like we dropped this, or the in-state group, which led it, we were proud supporters of it, dropped this into not having any of that context or existing public appetite for it. And we educated voters about it. The theme was accountability. It was around transparency of campaign finance and the idea you can hold your leaders accountable through this new system. And for what it's worth, we do disclose all of our donors that get engaged in ballot initiatives. So it wasn't dark money on our part.
Well, but we said it was, because that was a good technique on our part.
It's still and I would say when this initiative was on the ballot in Nevada in 2022, it did not include the campaign finance reform part, and it passed with 53% support. So it's still a hard issue because it is one that it takes time to explain. But I do think a solid majority of the public is there with us, and my hope is that over time the parties themselves see advantage in this. When I was writing my book, one of the more fascinating parts of it was realizing and learning that when the direct primary system was implemented over the old kind of smoke-filled rooms, it wasn't just outside reformers pressing for this change. The political parties lost control of that process as the states became more populist, as the parties began to fracture. And so there was an inside the party push for it. The modern day version of this is that I think we see both Democrats and Republicans nominating candidates that are far outside the mainstream of the general election voter. And as a result, are losing races, competitive races, because of this. In 2022, Republicans lost 5 U.S. Senate seats in swing states that were winnable had they not had a candidate quality problem. But the candidate quality is a function of the primary. Similarly in Oregon, one of the blue dogs there, Kurt Schrader, got primaried only for Democrats to then lose that seat. So while there's a reflexive opposition to it, I think there's a lot in these reforms that the parties can find advantage in, including reclaiming their own ability to, through their own process, nominate candidates. It's an illusion to think the parties have control over their primary system today, when so much of that influence is coming from, well-organized activists or outside interest groups. So my hope is that over time, the reflexive opposition will decrease. And in the meantime, public support will hopefully carry more of these initiatives across the finish line in other states.
We've got about 6 minutes left, and I want to ask a few audience questions. We've had 26 questions and comments, so we can't obviously get to them all. So what I'm going to do, this old moderator's trick I saw before, is I'll ask, I think maybe 3 or 4 of them just at the very end here, and you can answer, whichever one that kind of jumps out at you. Some of them overlap a bit. Some commenters and questioners talk about wouldn't gerrymandering and eliminating gerrymandering and the Citizens United problem couldn't campaign finance overhaul fix this. That's one point that's made. Secondly, one commenter says in Virginia, we have nonpartisan voter registration. What do you think about that as a means of at least opening primaries at least halfway? We have one commenter from Texas saying that, a very red state, he mentions Senator Begich indicated that RCV, ranked choice voting, can work in a moderate state. Is there a solid, viable strategy to move toward RCV in a state like Texas? And then let me just, the fourth one, states like Nevada. Nevada is one state that has, an initiative on its ballot again, I guess for the second time, except it's a twofer there. Wondering how adopting nonpartisan primaries and/or ranked choice voting in Nevada, which a competitive state, how that might change politics and elections in a state like that. So that's a lot there. We've got 5 minutes left. I want to let everyone have a couple of minutes to address any or all of that that I just threw at you.
I really don't know if there's a lot of states that do nonpartisan registration. I have a friend in New Hampshire, former congressman up there, and I'm certain he has told me that they do not register by party, and that when the primaries come, a person can walk into either, they can vote either way in it. But Nick, what's your research show on that?
Yeah, just a quick scan. There's 15 states with closed primaries where independents can't vote, 15 states where independents can choose a party ballot, 15 states with no party registration, so anyone can vote in either primary, and then 5 states with no party primary. And we really find the biggest impact is once you get down the spectrum to states that have moved away from party primaries, because every voter can select any candidate, and importantly, the general elections more usually become the elections that matter rather than the primary deciding it. And in the general elections, you have a much more representative, electorate. So that's where we see the biggest kind of impact on the polarization problem. And then I'll just take a quick stab at questions about some of those states, just to mention where this is going to be on the ballot in this November, or states that are pursuing it. So Nevada, there was a question about Nevada. That actually has to pass twice to amend the state's constitution. So voters will consider it again. The impact will be enfranchising 700,000 independents who can't currently vote in that state. And then the other states pursuing the similar type of reform include Montana, Idaho, Colorado, Arizona, and South Dakota. So if you add that in addition to the repeal effort in Alaska, 6 or 7 states may actually see this on the ballot in November, and others are looking at this for 2020.
Well, is there a commonality with the mountain and western states, that lot that opposed to the South, which is deep red these days?
Yeah, the commonality is that only about half the states actually have a ballot initiative process, and those are mostly Mountain West states. So in states that don't have a citizens initiative process, the strategy for these reforms is more incremental through the state legislatures. So Pennsylvania is an example where there's a bill that would allow independents to vote. It wouldn't take you to the Alaska style system, but it would enfranchise, more voters. Or in Georgia, there's a push to replace the runoff elections there with an instant runoff using ranked choice voting. So more incremental policies in the other set of states.
And one thing I'll say too, as you move west in Mississippi, it's just the culture of the West, more independent, more citizen driven. It's just a different kind of, mental thinking about how this works. I think that's why you see it growing there. I think the person who asked the question about Texas is an interesting, almost all major cities in Texas are run by Democrats. The state legislature is predominantly Republican. It's a mixed state in a lot of ways. And I think over time, Texas is changing to become more moderate. You can tell by some of even the policies now, some will say, Texas has some pretty strong policies, take it on immigration or whatever. But you can watch the underpinnings of that state, and there are changes that are occurring slowly because people are becoming more and more aware of what they can make a choice here. And the choice is you want good candidates, you want good elections, and this kind of hyper partisanship is not moving a state, a community, or a country forward, and people are frustrated. On top of that, the very first question, Greg, you asked about all these other things, as I mentioned earlier, this by itself does not get you good candidates. This gets you an opening. The door gets open. What has to happen is 2 or 3 more things, and that is you have to reform this financial onslaught of money. I mean, it is just beyond belief what it costs now to run elections. Second, the gerrymandering will continue to occur until state legislators make those decisions as they are driven by states, and that is a tough nut to crack in some states that want to keep control. And lastly, I think these reforms, and by your questions that you've seen there, Greg, there's a lot of interest in it, trying to understand how it all works. And I think all 3 of us would acknowledge that it's not perfect. We don't know the answers all the time. I have come from one side to the next, but I still have lots of questions. And I think it's incumbent upon us as individuals to figure out, and this piece that Nick just mentioned, when you have 700,000 voters in a state that cannot participate in an election process because the old system disallows you, that is ripe for change, because you cannot do that to people when they realize finally that, wait a second, I'm really mad at the system, which they are, and I can't vote. How does that work? And I would not want to be those state legislators going to that grocery store being confronted by those folks because it's not going to be comfortable, because it's the fundamental right to vote. And when you deny someone that, no matter if you're Republican, Democrat, Green Party, nonpartisan, they get a little upset.
All right. Well, the hour went by quickly. I apologize I couldn't get to all these great questions. I could spend several more hours doing this, but I want to respect everyone's schedule and thank everyone for attending. Thank you to our distinguished panelists for your sterling contributions to this discussion. And on behalf of the U.S. Association of Former Members of Congress, I thank you for attending our online panel discussion, and have a great rest of your day.